Hi folks, Dino Bob here, back in Bettatu Park for a new speed build. And this time I'm building a viewing area and support pavilion for a multi-species hadrosaur exhibit. Um, I had built this building, and you may see it in the background a couple of times. Um, and because it wasn't squared up to the world grid, it was giving me fits in terms of placing later elements on the build. So I moved it out here in the middle of nowhere in the park and decided to build it on grid. You can see I started by laying down a floor structure, and that was to help me line up elements to both get things squared up where I wanted it to be squared and to get a more even spacing on the curved parts. Doing this all in concrete to start, just to get the general shape. And right now you can see the walls that have been changed to concrete blocks. And by doing them the way I did them, they all ended up a little bit off, and so I spent a lot of time straightening that out. Having done that, I cut a lot of that video chunk out because it was repeating the same kind of actions, and I didn't think you'd enjoy sitting through all of that. Uh, I changed the upper run of walls mostly to glass, and that's the main viewing area, and duplicated the floor to create a roof. And one of the things I wanted to do was cant that roof up to give it a very specific kind of look and effect. Somehow in the course of that, I managed to get it slightly off skew, which is a problem that crops up, well, minor problem that crops up in a lot of places through the build. So I probably could have done this thing working the radial aspect of duplicating elements a little bit easier, but I had problem with that in the first build. So this time I chose to deliberately hand turn the stuff around to try and line up these elements with the glass panels. It was mostly successful, but not completely. And you can see extra ones on the other side, and I'm keeping part of that, but not the arched panels going forward. You can see all of those radial rafters being made taller. So this was for two reasons. One, to have them appear on both the inside and the outside of the build. That may not be, truly the structural way something would be built. Probably wouldn't be, but it looks cool in the game. And also I discovered when I built that first test building that when I pulled away from it, because those rafter beams were close to the surface of the roof, they would disappear at a distance, which was not really the effect I was going for. So hence the attempt to make them wider, and so they would appear more prominently and therefore be more visible when you pull the camera back away from the building. I wanted to convey the radial feature here without having it be a circular building. So this, when I looked at this area, I started to see visual discrepancies in where the rafters sat, and didn't like that. This is going to be very visible when you get any aerial views in the park, and I wanted to trim that up and make it smoother. I'd come back to it later in the build and have to do some tweaking to have things line up pretty well. The next step was making all the glass panels taller and then filling in some of the space to the roof. During this build, I will forget to come back and do the triangular pieces at the top of some of those glass walls, and that's something that I ended up doing without recording it. To work for the radial element, I needed to give those rafters a place to anchor, hence these two half circles and their approach to making this kind of look like a sun, I guess is the best way to describe it. Having played with the rafters for a while, it was time to go back and do the exterior walkway. Because I used the very large embiggened pieces for the floor, I didn't want that look of concrete for the outside. I wanted a wooden decking. And I am going to use that concrete for part of the visual effect, but it also provided me with a platform to make it a little bit easier to deal with moving these separate elements around for the platform and getting things to square up and approach what I had in my mind when I was working on this. You can see a lot of fussing around. I cut a chunk of that out so we could jump to what I was talking about playing with the concrete to get a different effect. And playing with the platform, making it a little bit shallower, and then working on the squared off section of the building. I wanted two main entrances into the structure, or exits. I guess, people go in both directions. But I didn't want that to be concrete either. Because of the way the walls overlapped, I decided to lean into that and created these sort of panels of the wooden texture at each side of the openings, and also extending the front wall and the side walls, so each of them stand out. And I wanted to have it be something of an art piece for the entrance. I played around, as you'll see, with a couple of different takes. Eventually decided that having those arcs off to the side on the walls wasn't really working, and ended up compressing them down to get that kind of interesting larger to smaller arc effect. I also ended up ultimately fiddling with this a little bit more after the build was finished, and shrinking the barred piece there that's making sort of the header over the entry, or making it narrower so it fit within the boards, and overall spruced it up a little. So in this section, I was filling in the gaps, and that was fiddly work, so, didn't keep you watching all of that till I was satisfied with how it looked. And that's when I decided I needed to address the entry from the building onto the walkway. So I added walls to be a dead end, so there was not a direct passage to the, if you will, the walkway, and from the what will eventually be the path in the park. And then went on to replicate the angled beams, flatten them down again, and set them up to be elements for the walkway around the building. This will be directly facing the habitat, and I wanted a standoff so the animals couldn't get too close to the guests. This looks like wood, and wood probably wouldn't be strong enough for the multi-ton animals that will be in this exhibit. So we can imagine that this is wood veneered steel. At least that's what I'm doing. Maybe you figure it ought to be some kind of modern magic composite material. Whatever works for you. Again, I cut out a bunch of repetitive video of tightening all that stuff up, and moved on to supporting that standoff. I decided to use that with naked steel, or do that with naked steel. And so I'm using the girder and an angled piece, and I will come back and add a vertical piece, change the color of these things to help blend them into the more earth-toned and brown building, and then do a lot of repeating again, which I am again sparing you. And moving on to the railing for this walkway around the building, making it out of the round metal column, again tinted to fit better to the color tones used in this building. Um, and a little bit of mesh on the lower part particularly to keep people from falling into the exhibit or having something drop and roll off the walkway. Uh, but I didn't want to do it all equally. I wanted a little bit of asymmetry to the rails. And once again, a long session of duplicating, which, once again, I am sparing you. And moving on to finishing it up, where I noticed that I didn't have the width of the building quite the way I wanted it. You can see I added a couple of longitudinal pieces there on the straight part of the building to add a sort of decorative element to this overhead look, and a lot of fussing once again with those rafters to get things to line up better and just give a better overall immediate glance feel of it. All of that fussing led to additional fussing, which was playing with the arch columns to get them to line up with the rafters and also to extend them. I wanted to get the end of the curved part of the rafter right about at the concrete ceiling edge. And time to add some more decorative elements, the columns, particularly at the entrance areas. And you saw the jump there, and we moved on to doing some of the decorative elements at the front of the building. I decided to put in planters between the two entrances and to either side, made out of a wall segment and some mulch, very simple, and threw in plants that not necessarily pertinent to these exhibits, but ones that work in this size and a little bit of color. I went with symmetrical plantings on the left and the right and slightly different plantings in the center because we need to have a symbolic hadrosaur as part of our branding for this building. So here comes Edmontosaurus, which is the only hadrosaur statue we have right now. So it has to stand in, even though it's, at least not right now, going to be part of the exhibit. And he needs something to stand on, so a little piece back there. And then, of course, I had to name the building, and we'll cut fast through the build of the lettering to its end, and my fiddling with picking a color for it and getting it centered over the door. Yeah, there we go. That looks fairly decent. And now to move to working inside. I duplicated the walls that existed and then changed them over to concrete, which is eminently colorable, and changing the color. I wanted both of these sides to share the same kind of color, even though they're having different modules for the food and drink stands that are in here. And I wanted to hide some of that branding for that very reason and have it all blend in. It's just the idea that struck me while I was building this. It also struck me I needed to seal off the in and out to the walkway from these eating and drinking areas. So a little bit of fiddling to light it all up, duplicate the implied wall of those posts onto the concrete and put in the various modules, set them up, give them a little seating, and just try and give a simple sense of appearance for this eating and drinking area for Hadrosaur Hall. I decided also then that it was a little plain, so I wanted to bring a little more color and patterning to it, and that's what you see me doing now. You'll be getting a sense that this is kind of fussy work, so I ended up duplicating a lot of these pieces and moving them over as a block and doing more adjusting and fiddling around on the other side. But again, sparing you some repetitive building details, because you see how it's done in this part, and you don't really need to see that again, I think. Maybe you do. If you do think you need that sort of thing, let me know. I'll take it into account for other videos. We don't have information signs yet in the game, but I wanted to imply that this building would have some of that. And these would be general information signs for the Hadrosaur Hall and its context in the time and place that these animals came from. I didn't put stand-ins for actual specific details of the animal signs. Leave that for later. And then a little bit of lighting on the outside, which led me to change the color of the name so that it would glow a little bit better. And in checking the nighttime stuff, I could see that there wasn't quite enough lighting for the eating and drinking area, so I decided to go in and add a couple more fluorescent lights in the ceiling, just enough to do that, because we wouldn't want a lot of light out in the viewing areas to disturb the animals. I could do the red color light thing again, and I may still do that, but I haven't done it yet on this build. So I did want to have some kind of lighting on the outside, and I chose eventually this particular light because it dawned on me I could use it in another place inside by burying it in a column and have those two lamps stick out on either side as if they were wall-mounted lamps. And, it's one piece instead of two, and that kind of stuff all adds up. In pulling the camera out to take a look at how it looked overall, I discovered I'd forgotten the doors, so I decided to do that. I know the doors have their own frames now, and that is normally a thing I like to do, but it looked not quite right with this build, and so I added the heavier timbers to trim out the door, and I made them wider so I could just use 3 timbers instead of 6, and inset the door itself in the center so it's sort of recessed on both sides and doesn't need to be duplicated either. Again, one fewer piece to put in, and these bills eat a lot of pieces, and eventually that eats into your piece count big time. So with the build done, it was time to bring it in and put it where it was supposed to be in the park and place it in there. And I discovered the pathing wasn't working, so I needed to rework the paths and mess with the terrain a little bit. And so I did that. But now we're running well over time for what I've been trying to hit, making this a long video. And for the actual animals, you'll have to tune in next week for the coming of the hadrosaurs and the modifications of their habitat for them. So this is Dino Bob. Thanks for stopping by. You know the drill on YouTube stuff. You all take care, be well, and stay kind to each other. Bye now.